in the West, we inherit the idea of law from those ancient conceptions of God, and it is even passed down into science, where we discuss laws of nature. But one recognizes more and more in the sciences that what we call laws of nature are simply observed regularities in the way things behave. And you, in order to observe regularities, you must look at things through something regular. That is to say, you must lay a ruler alongside them, or compare their behavior with the regular behavior of a clock. But clocks and rulers are human inventions. They are regular measures which we use for comparing the rates of change. Say, a clock is a measure of a rate of change. It's quite arbitrary. But we very easily compare our regulation measuring devices with what makes things happen, as if the sun rises because it's 6 in the morning. And that's being completely backwards in one's thinking. And we get into the same confusion when we imagine, for example, that money is wealth. Here we have fantastic wealth, you know, and we have the technological possibility of making everybody on earth the enjoyer of an independent income. We can't do it because people say, where's the money going to come from? Because they think money makes prosperity. It's the other way around. It's physical prosperity which has money as a way of measuring it. But people think money has to come from somewhere, like hydroelectric power or lumber or iron, and it doesn't. Money is something we invent, like inches. So you remember the Great Depression? When there was a slump? And what did we have a slump of? Money. There was no less wealth, no less energy, no less raw materials than there were before, but it's like you came to work on building a house one day, and they said, sorry, you can't build this house today, no inches. What do you mean, no inches? Just inches. We don't mean we got inches of lumber. Yes, we've got inches of metal. We've even got tape measures. But there's a slump in inches as such, you see. And people are that crazy. They can have a depression because they've got no inches to go around, or no dollars. That's all a lot of nonsense. But you see, because we get thinking backwards, making the metaphysical tail wag the dog, making the law rule things, whereas it doesn't. It's merely a way of measuring what happens. And so you see, when you get into Buddhistic thought, you don't get that confusion. You're the other way around. So you're looking at a system where, to go back to the Buddha's words, this arises, that becomes, which is a way of saying, you can't have this without that. You can't have here without there. You wouldn't know where here was unless you knew where there was. And they come into being together. You don't get first here and then there, or first there and then here. These arise interdependently. That's the meaning of interdependent origination. And to grasp the idea of interdependent origination is as important as the idea about seeing how things are related by space and intervals. And seeing, therefore, that you tend to look at life from a myopic point of view and see details, see the trees and not the forest, see yourself as something loosely related to everything else that's going on and not integral to it. You see the figure but ignore the background. But the figure and the background arise mutually. They are to each other as this is to that. And so we really have to rid our brains of the notion of causality. The notion of causality being that present sets of circumstances are the result of past sets of circumstances. And that therefore certain events which are called causes are responsible for following events called effects. And all this is an enormous piece of mumbo-jumbo. Because what is not seen and what is not clear in thinking that way is that in physical nature there are no separate events. This is startling to people. But it's really quite easy to see that there are no events in nature. Because you can ask very simply, let's take something called an event. How do we demark it from other events? At what point, shall we say, were you born? Were you born at parturition? Or when the doctor slapped you on the bottom? Or cut the umbilical cord? Or when you were conceived? Or when your father and mother were first attracted to each other? When was it? When did you begin? There's no way of deciding except arbitrarily. And for legal purposes, we say you were born at parturition. And that's when the astrologer casts your horoscope, except that other astrologers disagree and want the conception time. They say that's the real beginning. There isn't a real beginning. It goes back and back and back in an inseparable continuity. When are you dead? That's another big argument. And you can get all kinds of ideas about that. So once you see that an event is a term in an intellectual calculus, calculus being the way of measuring, say, curved formations by reducing them to point instants and counting it, you see? But actually, the point instants are imaginary. The curve wiggles along, and it doesn't stutter from point to point. But in calculus, you make it do that.
And this is also true of various philosophical systems. It's all right that philosophers should argue with each other. I'm not going to quarrel with that either. But from my standpoint, the more I look at it, the more the extraordinary variety of human opinions and ways of life becomes comparable to a flower garden where these plants and trees and worms and birds and snails and slugs are playing all kinds of different games. Now, some of you may be unaccustomed to this idea because I see some new faces here. But it's my fundamental philosophy that the universe is essentially a game. But we use the word game or we use the word play in varying senses, and it may give the wrong impression because very often people assume that when such a word is used, it indicates something trivial. As we say, it's only in play or only a game. And then when you consider what an appalling amount of suffering the universe contains, one wants to feel that it's worthwhile. You see, either you must take the point of view that if there is this deplorable suffering, the universe is one hell of a mess, and the only response that you can make to it is to do battle. Or you may say, no, it isn't really a mess. Somehow all this suffering amounts to something in the end. It creates energies. It's a kind of a process like an oyster suffering to mature a pearl. And therefore, people who feel bothered about that can't quite emotionally contain the idea that it's all a game. Because then, if that were so, I would be the sport of some cosmic process, whether God or whatever, that plays with me as a child might torture an insect a butterfly by pulling off its wings or burning it with a magnifying glass with the sun, or something like that. Only, as I will develop it, we shall see that there is no system in which somebody tortures and somebody else is tortured. In my view of the world, which is semi-Buddhist, semi-Hindu, the creator and the creature are one, and all beings whatsoever are the masks and plays and ploys of the central self. There is just this self, which plays itself through all forms, through all of us, endlessly.
So long as you are trying to make progress, you will go up. But up always implies down. So while you are trying to get better and better and better, that means that when you get to the best, you can only go on to the worst. And so you go round and round and round, ever chasing the illusion that there is something outside yourself, outside your here and now, to be attained that will make things better. And the thing is to recover from that illusion. So a Buddha means somebody who has woken up and discovered that running around this thing may be fun, and it may be good to run around, but if you think you're going to get something out of it, you're under illusion, because you're forever the donkey with the carrot suspended from his own halter. Now then, it goes on to say that there's only one place, one point in this wheel from which you can become a Buddha, and that's here. The Devas are too happy to become Buddhas, or to worry about becoming a Buddha. The Narakas are too miserable. The Asuras are too angry. The animals are too dumb, and the Pretas too frustrated. Only in the middle position, the position of man, which is, you could say, the equal position, the position of sufficient equanimity to begin to think about getting off this rat race. Only from there, you see, can you become a Buddha. So the position of a Buddha may be represented either as not on the wheel at all or as right in the middle of it. It makes no difference. And so he is just as in a way the axle point, the still point of the turning world, as to use T.S. Eliot's phrase, is the unmoved center, the unmoved mover, the primum mobile, the axle tree of the world. All thought the navel, that's why yogis are said to contemplate their navel. The navel isn't on their tummy, it's this place.
What is important to me is what happened to me, because that's my gift to you. And what happened to me for whatever karmic reasons. Opened me in such a way that I went from one day thinking I'm an ex-Harvard professor, I don't touch people's feet, seeing all this kind of slushy, going to rub his feet and grabbing at his feet and rubbing his legs, and this rather plumpish man with no teeth. And the next day, I was angling for it to get a hand on a foot, to just touch a toe. And when my hand finally got to the point where I was going to do it, he pulled his foot back under a blanket, talking to somebody else all the time. I mean, it was not like he did it to me. It was just, I thought, I'm not pure enough. Isn't that great? I mean, the Jewish guilt was right there, you know, right there at that moment. So I went into this kind of absolute psychosis with a lot of other people. I mean, could we look at him? Could we see him? Could we study his body? Could we rub his hand? Could, you know, you'd bring an apple and he'd throw it at you, hit you right in the crotch. That's deep teaching. But even at the beginning, while I was part of that hysteria of being around him and seeing him and touching him and all of that stuff, I saw through it. I saw that he wasn't it. He was and he wasn't. That what it was that I touched through him. Through him. He was a mirror that was showing to me my own beauty. In India, they say God, Guru, and self are one and the same. He was mirroring something in myself that I knew to be true. And my love towards him just kept growing and growing. So then he dropped his body. He died. He died out from under me. So there was nowhere to go to touch him or look at him or get him to scream at you or tell you to get the hell out of there. Because what he said to me most of the time was Jao, which means split. Go. Leave.
Well, I want to explain a little bit about why I should even be sitting here talking to you and why I'm qualified to do that, if I'm qualified to do that. A few years ago, my wife and partner and I organized land that we owned in Hawaii as a non-profit that could be turned into a botanical garden. And this is a unique botanical garden in that our focus is on psychoactive plants and plants with a history of shamanic usage. And even though we're a very modest effort, it turns out we're the only people in the world, as far as we can tell, who are actually doing this. You're all aware of the speed at which the rainforests of the world are being cleared. But what is never mentioned is the even more rapid disappearance of folk knowledge about the rainforest. I'm an optimist, and I believe that eventually the rainforest clearing will be halted, and there will be huge preserves in the tropics. But nothing will halt the homogenization of human knowledge and the abandonment of localized ancient folkways in favor of the kind of generic kinds of understanding that operate in the world cultural market. In the next 30 years, it's going to be the last opportunity that we will have to preserve 50, 100,000 years of folk medical knowledge relative to the tropics. So this is the real world political work that my wife and I do, and Kat runs it on a day-to-day basis. I'm its spokesman, but she does the grunt work and the organizing and organizes the expeditions and the collections. If any of you are of a philanthropic bent, this is something I would be interested in discussing with you on our own. For the rest of you, I simply want to inform you that this kind of effort is going on. If you find yourself in exotic foreign countries or planning to travel to remote tribal areas, we would be interested in signing you up to help in our collection efforts. I believe that the collecting and preserving of these psychedelic and psychoactive plants is equivalent to the preserving of ancient manuscripts that was done in the Dark Ages, preserving things we don't understand toward a brighter day when society will create an open enough climate of inquiry that these things can actually then be looked at. Well, so much for that. As far as my qualifications, they're pretty minimal in the academic realm. I have a degree in conservation of natural resources from the University of California at Berkeley, which is a little like saying, I have a degree in tap dancing from the University of Antarctica. But from the time that I was a very small child, I was an edge runner. And I don't know why, but this turned out to be a very fruitful natural style for getting ahead in the world. The exploration of edges, the oldest books, the forgotten countries, the unpronounceable islands, that sort of thing. And I was a rock collector and a butterfly collector and an amateur rocketeer and all these things. And when I analyzed these pursuits of mine, it was the pursuit of a certain flash of iridescence. The iridescence that you get when you break open ore-bearing rock, or the iridescence that you get when you capture certain kinds of butterflies in tropical environments, or the kind of iridescence that you get when you mix potassium perchlorate and sugar in a hot sauce pan and ignite it. In other words, pushing out at the edge of the permissible, at the edge of the probable, looking for a certain something, a scintilla, a spark, a possibility.
You have rented my mouth to say something to you. Now, I mean, I don't have any image that I know anything you don't, so that cuts me out of that one. So then what is it you want me to say? Well, the interesting thing I've begun to notice over the years is that what you want me to say is something you already know. And how do I know that? Because I say something infinitely wise that only the wisest people would understand. And you nod. Okay? So if you nod, you know. And if you know, why did you need to spend $20 to hear me tell you what you already know? So I've thought about this as a reasonable question, since I do this so often. And I realize that what we are is in the predicament of having to say over and over to ourselves, it's like the old stories, the kind of spiritual essence of our being. We have to just keep reminding ourselves, and we come together for this process, and we all need it. I need it too. I see in the audience many people who may not be as old as I am, but have memories. And I would just ask you, hasn't the journey been interesting? Hasn't it been fascinating? I mean, it actually blows me away to have survived, first of all, or survived in this form. And second, to get to the point where I really appreciate and enjoy the whole process. That's taken years. And it's been an interesting journey for me from inside my consciousness, not in terms of just the social events on the outside. So that I could watch my mind go from Western psychologist, professor, with a model of reality that said psychology's real. And I teach it as real. It's absolutely real. And then there's the psychedelic period after the mushrooms in 1961, when I then say it's relatively real. And that, as I see it, is the major thing that happened. That I went from a culture I'd grown up in that saw everything as absolutely real. Like I learned Newtonian physics as if it was real. Then Einstein came along and said it depends on where you're standing. So then I went through a lot of interesting stages. After I first got high, saw through the veil of who I thought I was, to appreciate who I was, or who I am, or who I will be when I finish being who I thought I was. If I move too fast for you, just raise your hand and tell me, because either we all go or no one goes, actually. When I found I couldn't stay high, no matter how well I used my technical skills, but that I always came down, and that took years. But then I realized that, and then I went to India to see, because I had been introduced to all of these incredible maps from the East, from Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Zen and all these different things.